Many Americans today are starting to realize that Jews played the leading role in dragging America into World War II. Some of us are uncomfortable with this truth, but it must be admitted. To demonstrate the leading role played by Jews, we will establish the following facts. First, there was a massively disproportionate, extensive, and influential Jewish presence in the Roosevelt administration, which swayed decisions when it came to deploying American military power. Second, the American public did not want war. Third, the influential Jews in America did want war. Fourth, Roosevelt surreptitiously complied with the influential Jewish demand for war. Fifth, the Jewish-controlled media in America promoted and drummed up support for the war. Sixth, America was dragged into the war under false pretenses on behalf of Jews. We will now provide the specific data and name names. It's well known among historians that Roosevelt was heavily dependent on Jewish supporters during his gubernatorial term. When it came time to mount a presidential campaign, his Jewish supporters were there to ensure he won. As Myron Sholnick explains, a number of wealthy Jewish friends contributed to Roosevelt's campaign fund to get him nominated. Henry Morgenthau Jr., Lehman, Jesse Strauss, and Lawrence Steinhardt. Once he secured the nomination, Roosevelt's campaign was then heavily underwritten by the Jew Bernard Baruch. Thus, once he secured the presidency, Roosevelt's administration contained a higher proportion of Jews than any other. Jews were indeed more prominent than ever before in American history. We will focus on just the top 5 Jews who had the most influence. These Jews were so prominent that they were known at the time as the President's Jews, and they had the largest hand in swaying decisions within the presidency. They were Louis Brandeis, Felix Frankfurter, Henry Morgenthau, Sam Rosenman, and Ben Cohen. Louis Brandeis at the time was a sitting Supreme Court justice, having been placed there by his friend Woodrow Wilson in 1916. Brandeis had been meeting to discuss policy with Roosevelt even prior to Roosevelt's election in 1932, and was the Jew who sent Roosevelt a blueprint for the New Deal. In 1938, Brandeis was the first one who made his call on Roosevelt on behalf of influential Jews, as the involvement of a Supreme Court justice in government administration may have been viewed as unethical. Brandeis generally worked through Jewish intermediaries like Frankfurter and Cohen to get messages to the president. Frankfurter was particularly important on a day-to-day basis within the administration. By 1933, he had become probably Roosevelt's most influential advisor. Frankfurter had so much power over Roosevelt that American General Hugh Johnson called him the most influential single individual in the United States, insinuating his boys into obscure but key positions in every vital department. As Europe was already on the brink of war, it was Frankfurter who was instrumental in initiating a series of secret correspondences between Roosevelt and Churchill at a very sensitive time. Frankfurter would later be given a nomination to the Supreme Court in January 1939. Morgenthau also was extremely close to Roosevelt, so close in fact that Roosevelt made him the second Jew ever to join a presidential cabinet. He was named Secretary of Treasury in early 1934, occupying that position right through the end of the war. Rosenman was the Jew who functioned as Roosevelt's chief speechwriter and leading general advisor. Thus, many of Roosevelt's infamous statements leading up to and during the war originated in the brain of this one Jew. Benjamin Cohen, a Jewish lawyer, was one of the key drafters of Roosevelt's New Deal and had the president's ear, acting as an unofficial emissary of Brandeis and Frankfurter. It was Cohen who became the lead architect and executor of the infamous Bases of Destroyers war plan from mid to late 1940. It was Cohen who concocted a plan by which America would loan 50 warships to the UK, as the UK was already well into the war and in desperate need of assistance, in exchange for certain global bases that they held. This was highly illegal at the time, but Cohen launched a series of unprovable assertions about national defense to gain approval for it. And it was none other than the fellow Jew Frankfurter who approved it. The Germans, naturally, interpreted this as a veritable act of war by a supposedly neutral America. This blatantly underhanded move by these two Jews, networking within and without the Roosevelt administration, was decisive in causing Hitler to sign a mutual defense pact with Japan in October 1940. And it was this agreement, in turn, which automatically triggered Germany's declaration of war on the US following the attack on Pearl Harbor. So to make that clear, a Jewish lawyer, Cohen, wanted to illegally insert America into strategic bases, and his fellow Jew, Justice Brandeis, granted approval. This provocation then put Germany in a position to respond by agreeing to a mutual defense plan with Japan, which would then automatically trigger Germany's declaration following Pearl Harbor. Had it not been for the actions of just these two Jews, the provocation would not have occurred. In fact, had none of these Jews been occupying their positions, America would have never entered the war at all. And those were only the top 5 Jews. There were several other Jews operating behind the scenes in influential roles. Bernard Baruch, Jew, was the financial advisor and prominent confidant of both Roosevelt and Churchill. You heard that right. The same Jew, Bernard Baruch, operated internationally to advise both Roosevelt and Churchill financially. Other influential Jews surrounding Roosevelt included Jerome Frank, who was Roosevelt's close aide along with the Jew David Niles. James Warburg, son of Paul Warburg, was another financial advisor. Other Jews included Eugene Black, who was named the Fed chairman, and Jesse Strauss, who was appointed as ambassador to France, while his nephew, Nathan Strauss, came to head the U.S. Housing Authority. Herbert Fries, another Jew, was the influential economics advisor for the State Department. We could go on. When one really examines the details, it's breathtaking how Jews dominated the Roosevelt administration. It would be fair to simply call it a Jewish administration. Bear in mind here that we aren't merely running a headcount of Jews, we are also examining the specific influence and power they had in controlling the administration. That is what's most important. Thus, detractors who say, but there were also non-Jews in the administration, so you can't blame Jews, are missing the point. The point is, we are focusing on the influence these Jews had, not just their vast overrepresentation. All of this is definitive evidence of the massive, extensive, and influential Jewish influence on getting America into war. Mainstream historians know this, but they can't discuss it in great detail without risking their careers over charges of anti-Semitism. Now, while all of these Jews were drumming for war, the American public overwhelmingly wanted to avoid the war. This is uncontroversial. Around 80% to 90% of American citizens, according to Gallup polls and surveys conducted at the time, opposed any American involvement in the war, and leading figures like Charles Lindbergh warned of the dangerous Jewish influence. It was not a secret. One survey that was published in 1938 asked the question, if another war like World War I develops in Europe, should America take part again? Fully 95% of American respondents replied, no. These figures generally held up right until Pearl Harbor. The media at the time, controlled by Jews, bombarded Americans with pro-war propaganda and did anything it could to demonize and vilify Hitler. As early as 1933, the Jew-owned New York Times was inventing horror stories about Germany to frighten the American mind. Of course, for the Germans, American media meant Jewish media, and they knew these lies were being spread about them. A communique by the German ambassador to the US, Hans Luther, observed that America possessed, quote, the strongest Jewish propaganda machine in the world. This comment was made in light of Jewish dominance in Hollywood and the fact that Jews owned the major American newspapers, the New York Times and the Washington Post. Luther's impression was shared by German leadership throughout the war. Goebbels, for example, wrote the following in his journal entry of April 24, 1942. Some statistics are given to me on the proportion of Jews in American radio, film and press. The percentage is truly frightening. Jews control 100% of the American film business and between 90% and 95% of American press and radio. In October 1937, Roosevelt gave his infamous quarantine speech. Here we find one of the first indications, if indirect, that he anticipates a time when the US would come into direct conflict with Germany, and he subtly propagandizes the American public in favor of war on behalf of Jews. The danger of Hitler is exaggerated, neutrality is disparaged, baseless assertions and conditional statements are thrown out, and all in the language of peace. Should Hitler prevail, let no one imagine that America will escape, that this Western Hemisphere will not be attacked. We are determined to keep out of war, said Roosevelt, yet we cannot insure ourselves against the disastrous effects of war and the dangers of involvement. Sparing no hyperbole, he added that, if Germany initiates a war, the storm will rage till every flower of culture is trampled and all human beings are leveled in a vast chaos. This is difficult to read, except as an indication that the path of violent confrontation had already been decided upon, and that the long process had begun to persuade a reluctant public that they must support it. By this time, Jewish lobbies around the world, especially in the US and the UK, began to press hard for military action to intervene on behalf of their beleaguered fellow Jews in National Socialist Germany, and to once again overthrow a regime they hated, never mind that the Germans may have had some right to self-determination. Just as today Jews use their international networks to agitate for wars and even cancel individual people who speak out against them, they did the same then. One of the first indications of this came in early 1938, from the Polish ambassador to the US, Jerzy Potocki. He reported back to Warsaw on his observations of the American political scene as follows. The pressure of the Jews on President Roosevelt and on the State Department is becoming ever more powerful. The Jews are right now the leaders in creating a war psychosis, which would plunge the entire world into war and bring about general catastrophe. This mood is becoming more and more apparent. In their definition of democratic states, the Jews have also created real chaos. They have mixed together the idea of democracy and communism, and have above all raised the banner of burning hatred against National Socialism. This hatred is becoming a frenzy. It is propagated everywhere by every means, in theaters, in the cinema, and in the press. The Germans are portrayed as a nation living under an arrogant leader who wanted to conquer the whole world and drown all of humanity in an ocean of blood. In conversations with Jewish press representatives, I have repeatedly come up against the inexorable and convinced view that war is inevitable. This international jury exploits every means of propaganda to oppose any tendency in America toward any kind of consolidation and understanding between nations. In this way, the conviction is growing steadily, but surely in public opinion here, that the Germans and their satellites in the form of fascism are enemies who must be subdued by the democratic world. Another indication of the international Jewish community pressuring America into war came by way of a letter by Senator Hiram Johnson, written to his son that same year. In the letter, the pro- and anti-war camps are made clear as follows. All the Jews are on one side, wildly enthusiastic for the president and willing to fight to the last American. But everybody is afraid, I confess I shrink from it, of offending the Jews. For his part, the Jew Bernard Baruch was certainly itching for a war. Speaking to General George Marshall, he said, "We are going to lick that fellow Hitler. He isn't going to get away with it." One wonders how Baruch would know this all the way back in 1938. Actually, it's not much of a mystery. Churchill evidently told him so. As Sherwood recounts, Churchill, who was still First Lord of the Admiralty, said this to Baruch: "War is coming very soon. We will be in it, and you, the United States, will be in it. You, Baruch, will be running the show over there, but I will be on the sidelines over here." This is an astonishing claim. How would Churchill know such a thing in 1938? What could have convinced Churchill that war was inevitable, and that the Jew in America would be running the show? Was it the Kristallnacht, perhaps? Was that the last straw for the global Jewish lobby? Apparently, Lord Beaverbrook thought so. Writing to Frank Gannett in December 1938, he made this striking statement. "The Jews are after Prime Minister Chamberlain. He is being terribly harassed by them. All the Jews are against him. They have got a big position in the press here in the UK. I am shaken. The Jews may drive us into war, and their political influence is moving us in that direction." Beaverbrook was a prominent and influential media executive and politician. He was well positioned to make such a claim. A prominent American military man was also starting to speak out publicly on the pernicious Jewish influence. General George Moseley saw the Jewish pressure building for global war, and in a speech in Philadelphia said, "The war now proposed is for the purpose of establishing Jewish hegemony throughout the world." He would later testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee on June 1st, arguing that Jews in America were allied to a global Jewish state and should be banned from public office and denied the right to vote. He identified organizations like the American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Congress, the Jewish Labor Committee, and B'nai B'rith as pushing for war on behalf of world Jewry. He said, quote, "The Jews must bring themselves to the realization that the 120 million people composing the American nation are not going to be run by Jews in whole or in part." Moseley's statement was, of course, stricken from the record. Another testimony came in mid-1939 by Joseph Kennedy. Yes, the Kennedy. At the time, he was the American ambassador to Great Britain. Kennedy expressed his concerns to his colleagues in London about the Jewish role in pushing America toward war. He said, quote, "Jews are running the United States, and the democratic policy of the United States is a Jewish production." A month later, the British ambassador to Germany, Neville Henderson, confirmed that the hostile attitude in Great Britain was the work of Jews. Here again we see a parallel action by Jews on both sides of the Atlantic. This would be consistent with Baruch's role as a prominent confidant of both Roosevelt and Churchill. So here we have some of the most prominent American officials warning each other about the Jewish push for war. The Jewish-owned media was also becoming even more active by this time. Most of the daily newspapers pushed for American entrance into the war. These included the New York Times, the New York Herald Tribune, the Chicago Daily News, and Time magazine, all owned by Jews. The Jewish motion picture industry also did its part to get America into war. Early efforts like Beasts of Berlin came out in 1939 and set the stage for a flood of Jewish-approved films over the next 3 years. In 1940, the Jews in Hollywood released graphic and high-impact films like Escape and Mortal Storm. In May, 2 major Jewish studio heads, Jack and Harry Warner, whose real names were Itzhak and Hirsch Wonskalaza, actually wrote to Roosevelt, assuring him that they would, quote, "do all in our power within the motion picture industry to show the American people the worthiness of the cause for which the free peoples of Europe are making such tremendous sacrifices." Let that sink in. 2 enormously powerful and influential Jews in Hollywood were in direct correspondence with the sitting president in America, letting the president know that they would use their films to promote war. By 1941, more Jewish filmmakers and producers were working pro-war themes into their films. It became so noticeable that the anti-war movement at the time, which was called America First, warned that this belligerent Jewish propaganda was becoming widespread and was loading lies into their films to cause Americans to want war. In August of the same year, 4 months before Pearl Harbor, Senator Gerald Nye also warned about this Jewish war propaganda in Hollywood, arguing that these film studios had become the most gigantic engines of propaganda in existence to rouse the war fever in America and plunge this nation to her destruction. By that time, nearly 36 major pro-war films had already been released. In the end, more than 60 explicitly pro-war films were produced, along with dozens of ordinary films that incorporated subtle pro-war messages by Jews in Hollywood. The Jewish propaganda pushing Americans toward war caught the attention of Charles Lindbergh, who said, "The greatest danger Jews pose to this country lies in their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government." By March of 1941, it was the Jewish lobby that pressured Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed America to send armaments and military supplies to Britain and other nations. Thus, on all fronts, it was powerful and influential Jews driving peaceful Americans toward war in order to destroy the hated German regime, hated simply because Germans sought to have their own nation free of Jewish influence. There is no doubt that Lindbergh was right, that British Jews were pushing the US toward war and that they were succeeding. A profound admission came from the leading British Zionist, Chaim Weizmann, delivered via letter to Churchill. Quoting his letter at length here, "There is only one big ethnic group in America which is willing to stand to a man for Great Britain and a policy of all-out aid for her, the 5 million Jews." From Secretary Morgenthau, Governor Lehman, Justice Frankfurter, down to the simplest Jewish workman or trader, they are conscious of all that this struggle against Germany implies. It has been repeatedly acknowledged by British statesmen that it was the Jews who, in the last World War, effectively helped to tip the scales in America in favor of Great Britain. They are keen to do it, and may do it, again. So here we have the most explicit admission by a Jew himself. American Jews, in conjunction with British Jews, hold the key to war. They are keen to do it. Virtually upon command, they can tip the scales, again, and drive Americans into another war that Americans themselves desperately wish to avoid. And not just the most powerful and influential Jews, but even the average Jews, all did their part as a collective Jewish whole, 5 million Jews strong, to plunge America into war, whether Americans wanted it or not. Despite all of the Jewish war propaganda, the American public still opposed war by about 80%, a clear majority. Roosevelt's Jews were increasingly desperate. At that point, only a direct attack on American soil could alter public opinion. Roosevelt had been harassing the Germans for 2 years, but Germans refused to bite. What to do? There is evidence that the Pearl Harbor attack was effectively a false flag event. While they did not directly conduct the attack, the Jewish Roosevelt administration did everything it could to encourage and then allow the Japanese to strike, and then to feign shock when it actually happened. Similar to how Israel is said to have allowed the events of October 7, 2023 to occur. Here are some key elements of how the Jewish administration in America allowed the attack. The earliest explicit indication that some such attack plan was in the works comes from October 1940 in the McCollum Memorandum. Commander Arthur McCollum was director of the Office of Naval Intelligence's Far East Asia section when he issued a 5-page letter to 2 of his superiors. The memo describes a situation in which a neutral US is surrounded by hostile nations across 2 oceans and notes that Germany and Italy have lately concluded a military alliance with Japan directed against the United States. This was a mutual defense pact, such that an attack against Japan would be considered by Germany by default to be an act of war. This gave the Jewish Roosevelt administration 2 paths to dragging America into the war: an attack by Germany or an attack by Japan. Germany was scrupulously avoiding conflict, but perhaps Japan could be engaged. This was evidently well understood within the military establishment. As McCollum explained, it is not believed that in the present state of political opinion, the US government is capable of declaring war against Japan without more ado, and it is barely possible that vigorous action on our part might lead the Japanese to modify their attitude. Interesting language that essentially means Japan does not really want war either, but perhaps we could provoke them enough that they would launch a first strike. The memo concludes with this striking sentence: "If by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better." The plan could hardly be clearer. On 19 August 1941, Churchill himself confirmed that the Roosevelt administration was determined that they should enter the war. Everything is being done to force an incident. The president has made it clear that he would look for an incident which could justify America opening hostilities. So here we have an admission from Churchill himself that it was indeed the plan of the Jewish Roosevelt administration to look for and indeed force an incident that would ensure America's hostile entry into war, regardless of what 80% of Americans wanted. On November 25, 1941, just 12 days before the attack, Roosevelt held a war cabinet meeting at the White House. Secretary of War Henry Stimson wrote the following in his journal entry for that day: "Roosevelt brought up the event that we were likely to be attacked perhaps next Monday, December 1st, for the Japanese are notorious for making an attack without warning, and the question was how we should maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. It was a difficult proposition." This became known as Stimson's infamous maneuver remark. Once again, it is clear and explicit that an attack would be allowed to occur. 8 years after the attack, the president's administrative assistant Jonathan Daniels recalled events of that time. There was a massive warning before Pearl Harbor. As a matter of fact, warning had been clear for many months before Pearl Harbor. The increasing menace had been understood and accepted. Of course, even senators can now read to precise clarity, to the place and the hour. the warnings we possessed. The blow was heavier than Roosevelt had hoped it would necessarily be. In 1989, a 90-year-old British naval intelligence officer named Eric Nave came forward with a stunning testimony that the Brits also had detailed foreknowledge of the attack days before the event. Nave's decoding of Japanese battle commands is what made the intention to attack clear, and the intention was expressed several days before the raid took place. His revelations add to the evidence that Churchill and probably Roosevelt allowed the attack to go ahead, unchallenged, as a means to bring America into the Second World War. Nave added this: "We never had any doubt about Pearl Harbor itself. It should never have happened. We knew days, even a week before." Nave died in 1993, his story unacknowledged. So these are testimonies from some of the highest officials, including Churchill himself, that the attack on Pearl Harbor was known about in advance and allowed to happen. The Jewish Roosevelt administration got what it wanted, and America was then plunged into war. The vast majority of Americans didn't want war, but Jews did everything they could to force the war anyway. To summarize what we have established here, there was indeed an extensive and influential Jewish presence in the Roosevelt administration. These Jews wanted war, even though Americans did not want war. Jews used their control over the American media and government to drag America into war, against the will of the American people. And the US entered the war under false pretenses, on behalf of Jews. This is sufficient to show that it was indeed Jews, acting as a fifth column in America and as a superstate internationally, coordinating with other Jews in Europe. It was Jews who plunged Americans into war. Had it not been for Jews in positions of power and influence, in American government and media, Americans would have never died in that war.